Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is John Allen. John Allen is a Glenbrook South English teacher. He has been teaching there since 1993. He is also the Academy teacher at Glenbrook South. Welcome, John.
Hi, Yvonne. Thanks for having me.
Well, you wrote 3 books called Do You Mind? Can you tell us how they came about?
Yeah, back in the early 90s, I was living in Boston with my wife, Mary Jean, and my friends, Cynthia and Scott, were living in Brattleboro, Vermont. And we would go over to their barn. They lived in a barn. And we would have dinner with them and spend the weekend with them. And they had a tradition where they would have dinners, and then at the end of the dinner, they'd play the question game. And on one particular night, it was our first night with the question game, there was one other couple there with us, along with Cynthia and Scott, and we played the question game. And it goes basically like this. One person at the table, and you rotate through this, poses a question to the whole table, and then the whole table answers it, and then the person who posed the question gets to go last. If you don't like the question, you're uncomfortable with the question, you can say pass, and nobody can hassle you about that. You just say pass. But the questions are meant to get at how you're feeling about things, how you see the world, something that you think is extraordinary. And so we played the question game, and it was just really, really wonderful. It was a feeling that I liked a lot, everybody at the table liked a lot. And so that stayed with me because it was interesting, you know, Mary Jean and I would talk about how we remembered that night and why that night was emblazoned in our memories. And I thought about it was because of that question game, because there was this connection among all of us and this interest among all of us about how we see the world and how we think about things. And we got to learn things about each other that we wouldn't have learned perhaps in normal conversation. And that connection is something that emblazoned that memory, that strengthened that memory, and I still remember it very much today, some 30 years later.
So you were inspired to write a book? I mean, did you know you were going to write 3? I mean,
No.
how does that happen?
In fact, a long time after the question game, we would just play it informally with people, and it was just kind of a nice thing to do. But then when I started thinking about projects and I kept thinking about questions, I decided I would make it sort of a game for myself to collect as many questions that would work for a question game as possible.
Yes.
So on my computer, I had a place where I would just, I could easily, when a question came to mind, I had it on my phone too, I would write down the question. I just was going to collect as many questions as I possibly could to see what I could come up with.
That's a very interesting approach to writing a book, because usually books we're always looking for answers, or we're always looking for a story, but this is the beginning of stories, right? A question.
Right. And actually when I was putting the books together, when I put the first one together, I not only had all the questions, I probably had 160 questions, and then I just culled away the ones I thought that were repetitive or didn't really hit the mark.
Yeah.
And then I had the first book has 137 questions, and I took those 137 and I tried to put them in an order that represented a sequence of thought, a progression of thought that is almost like a narrative.
Okay.
Like if you went through them and read through them, you would feel an approach or a narrative emerging from your own thinking about the questions.
That's very interesting. That's to have a narrative through a series of questions,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
To build that.
And within the questions themselves, the most pleasurable thing is to hear somebody else tell a story in their answer. Their answers are going to be stories about themselves.
Yes.
And those narratives are what I believe connect us and help us understand each other. Sometimes we don't understand each other's narratives. Like people have these stories that they live by, but we often don't know them. And even though we think we know the person, we don't really know what story they're living or how they think of the story they're living.
Yes.
And sometimes what happens is we trample on them,
Yes.
And if we can know that story, we won't be trampling on them, and we can connect better with each other. And we don't mean to trample on them, it's just that we just don't know
unaware,
them. And that these questions get at that so that we can better understand each other and get closer to each other.
Well, this is very interesting because I think that your when I initially looked at your books, I thought that this is great for, let's say, people who are getting married or
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
who are dating,
Mm-hmm.
who really need to explore questions beyond what you like to eat and what movies you like to see.
Yeah.
You see, and something more that helps them build a relationship.
Well, I think that's true. I think a lot of the question books that I've seen place people in either or situations that are just seem impossible. Or they ask them about their favorite food or their favorite drink or their favorite place.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to avoid that. I tried to
Yes.
get at questions where a person could be more creative about their answer, that they had to creatively think about how they're even going to approach the question. So that,
Well, I noticed too that your questions, let's say you ask about machines, right?
right,
But it depends on the person to define what they think is a machine.
exactly.
Right? Isn't you don't write too much. I mean, you give them something that you will have different answers from different people
Yeah.
because what is a machine, right?
Yeah, and that's the goal. One of the big goals of the questions is, as an answer to the question, you have to figure out, well, how am I actually even going to approach the question? And then once you figure out how you're going to approach the question, because there's multiple ways of approaching it,
Yes.
that also tells us something about the person and also tells you something about you. Like I ask a question that's very simple. What's next? Or what time is it? Or
Yes.
what's your deal?
Yes,
You
and
know?
I like that because the time.
Yeah.
Time means so many things,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Is it the exact, clock, right? Because that's what I also find out. I test these questions with my children. I play this game with your game with my children. I find that children, their answers are shorter, but they also think very concretely. Oh, what
Yeah.
time it is? Oh, it's what's on the clock.
Yeah.
But time for as we grow older, right? What part of phase of life we're in,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Or what is on our mind,
Yeah.
those are all time, right?
And it can be really fun and really playful and really creative to say, I'm not going to tell you what time it is on the clock. I'm going to tell you what time it is for me right now.
Yes.
And that may be, it's time for me to change something. It's time for me to think in a different way. It's time for me to rethink. And those can be really, really interesting answers.
What kind of response have you had from your books? Have you met people or a group of people who answer your questions?
I haven't seen anything like that. Starting with my family members, I come from a family where we don't share this kind of stuff naturally. And I remember a couple conversations, one with my two brothers. We were out for dinner, and one of my brothers said, well, I probably should ask you about your book. And I said, well, the best way to do that was, let's just do a question.
Yes.
And so he picked a question, and we did the question. And I have to say, and I said to this after he answered, I said, Jim, my brother Jim, I said, I've learned more about you in this question than I have probably in my whole life knowing you.
Yes.
And I love that. It was just such a great moment. And the same thing with my younger brother. I mean, we just don't talk in those ways, but the questions allowed us to do that. And I remember that dinner really well because of our connectedness. It also helps memory.
You mentioned this intimacy, and
Yeah.
and I wonder if it's just is stored in a different part of our brain. It's not the mundane routine part of our brain.
Right.
That somehow these conversations become tucked away for a long time.
Well, and this is something that I'm concerned about right now, is that more and more we're a distracted culture. We're a fragmented culture. We're looking at things for literally milliseconds now.
Yes.
And we have so many things calling to our attention and competing for our attention that we don't have these cohesive, coherent, integrated, intimate moments. And these are the moments that end up mattering to us. And I think a lot of us are starved for this, even though we don't know what we're starved for. But when we have these moments, like, oh yeah, that's it. It's kind of like when all the power goes out. we have these moments where, oh, it's just us.
Yes.
And what are we going to do? The power went out, but then we
Yeah.
realized, oh, this is actually quite fun. And so these questions, I think in terms of memory, what happens is when you have a really emotional connection to the moment, to the place, to the people, that's what makes a memory strong, and that's what makes a memory
Yeah.
important to who you are as a human being.
Right,
you know?
because all of our senses are not overloaded. I
Right.
guess I feel sometimes I feel like the multimedia era is just too much. There's sounds, there's lights flickering. You know,
Right.
even with children's playgrounds, there's just so much going on.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I'm not sure if it's we need that all the time, right?
Yeah.
So. And you, so tell us a little bit about how the third book came to be.
Oh, that's an interesting story. So I didn't know how many of these I was going to do, but I think with the third one, I was like, I got to go on to some other projects now. But interestingly, my wife and I, Mary Jean and I, were flying out to California to see my family over Christmas break. And we were on the plane, and we got on the plane, and we were in the really crowded seats, and my wife, Mary Jean, said, well, you know, I can't stand these seats. They're so cramped. It's just like being, you know, at the orchestra, because we complain about how the orchestra seats are so cramped, too.
Uh-huh.
And what we didn't realize is that the assistant concertmaster for the CSO was sitting right next to us.
No way.
I mean, what are the chances of that happening?
Right.
And so we started talking to him, and we had this really long conversation about music, because Mary Jean's a musician, I'm a musician. We met at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And so we started talking. His name's David Taylor, and we started talking to David about music and so on. And we were talking about our favorite musicians. And one thing that he said that really stuck with me, and again, this is one of those conversations that's just like, it's so memorable because we were sharing such important and interesting, intimate things. And he said, for him, what makes a great musician is what happens between the notes.
Wow.
And I was like,
Oh
wow,
my
I have
gosh.
never thought about that. What's happening between the notes? And so as a musician, of course, when I got home, I just ran with that in terms of my own guitar playing. And I started thinking about thinking about what's happening between the notes when I'm playing. And as it turns out, he's right. Tons of things are happening between those notes
Wow.
to help me not only as a musician, but also to help me as a lover of music and to understand music. But I also thought about, what if I use that metaphorically? Are we listening to what happens between the notes in our daily lives?
Yes.
And so
transitioning from one activity to another
Exactly.
constantly, right?
So I thought this is actually an interesting part of human consciousness, is our ability to see between the notes, metaphorically, of our daily lives and how we interact with each other. So then I thought of this third book as questions that get at the between the notes sort of thing. And not all of them do that, but it was just a way of thinking about this third volume. And so I called it Questions for Conscious, something between the notes, questions for creativity and consciousness.
So there is something more thematically coherent in the third one. That's really
And like I said,
interesting,
not
right?
everything in that book does that, but it was a way of thinking about questions that I'd never done before.
But that's very interesting, because I heard on Science Friday one time that they can now make robots and play a symphony, play everything correctly, right? But then they said that the human ear can listen to it, but then when they hear a human play it, they know the difference, and the only difference is that the notes are never exactly the same length.
Right.
There's just, and that tiny hesitation or the prolonged note makes it a appeal to the human brain, that they feel sad or they feel happy and all those emotions.
Yeah, and I've got to believe that that's really what's going to endure. I mean, it is kind of scary to think about how close artificial intelligence is getting to mimicking human behavior and human thought.
Yes, and to have
maybe,
human
as you're saying, what the computer, artificial intelligence can't get at is what's happening between these notes, these gestures of human behavior and thinking and emotion.
Yes.
That I don't know how that could be replicated. I hope it never can.
It is, and the lingering notes, that makes people really enjoy song.
Right.
Is that human contact? Yeah.
Well, in regard to these questions, again, another musical analogy is you know, when we answer these questions, it's spontaneous. They can't be planned. You don't know what question you're going to get.
Right.
And you don't know how you're going to feel based on who's around you and what's around you and what you had for dinner.
Yes.
And what you walked into that conversation with that particular day. That can't be replicated. That's who we are as human beings. And my guitar teacher, John Holmquist, once said, you know, people go to live performances not to hear the music, but to hear the music being played by you at that particular moment, at that place in time. It's going to be different every time.
Yes.
It can't be replicated.
Yes.
And that's why you go, because a live performance is unique.
Yeah, that's what I hear as well about plays, right?
Right,
You have
exactly.
musicals
Live
and
theater.
people who are there, and that what they enjoy is also that it's never, can't be the same
Right,
twice.
yeah.
Right? That moment in time.
And I'm hoping that that's built into these books, that sort of spontaneity and that humanity that can't be, you have to be there in order to get it. You can't see it over the web. You can't be replicated in a video. You have to be with that person in that moment in order to get it.
Yes. That's a very interesting, very, very good point about intimacy and the moment and being that part of the moment.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the marketing of the book. I know you feel like that's the part that, as far as producing a book, writing, producing, you really enjoy that. What do you think about marketing? What could you tell our audience about that and being a self-publisher?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll work backward then. The marketing itself, I discovered, and not in any way a surprise, is by far the most difficult thing. And it's probably more difficult than it's ever been for anyone. It's kind of easiest in terms of now we can self-publish. And we can self-publish in very powerful, beautiful ways. All the tools are out there and available to create a beautiful text, a beautiful body, you know, like the book looks beautiful.
Yes.
It's all there. You can even load it up to Amazon and put it on Amazon, and you might think, well, once it's on Amazon, it's gonna just fly off the shelves. It'll be great. Not at all. People, the art of getting people to know that product is there is an incredibly difficult art. It's very creative. You have to be very savvy. There's a lot to learn. It's not intuitive. It's a highly skilled thing that you have to learn. And I haven't learned it, to be honest with you.
But
that was the
wasn't-
least interesting part of this whole project for me.
But it wasn't the intent, you say, right?
It wasn't the intent. The
What is
intent was,
yeah.
my goal was, can I create these questions? It'll be fun to create these questions. Can I put them in a way can I collect them in a way that's artful? Can I then learn the tools of production, like self-publishing production? All of that came pretty fluidly. It wasn't easy, but it was within reach for me. What I find that's out of reach for me, unless I make a huge effort, would be the marketing part of it. It's far more complex and far more competitive and sophisticated.
Tours or readings or
Yeah, I don't even know if it's even doing tours anymore as much as how do you compete with so many outlets now that are trying to get people's attention on the internet, on the web. I mean, it's a very sophisticated game out there. And it's one that, again, I'm not sure I even want to learn. I don't know if I'm really motivated enough to do that. I had a lot of fun. What Amazon allows you to do is once your book is self-published, you can electronically give away copies of your books. And so I loved doing that. I gave away probably 1,500 copies of my books for free and just allowed people to have them that way because I'm not trying to make money off of these.
Yes.
If I were a professional author,
uh-huh.
I would have to learn these skills in order to survive, but I have the luxury of not doing that.
And this, the format being digital could be very useful for our time, right? Because people are with a phone or they can focus on this anywhere they go.
Yeah.
And that it could be a format itself that will pull them out.
It helps distribution a lot. It makes it easy for people. But again, how do you get people to know that this book exists?
Yes.
That's still something that I don't understand completely, and I would have to do a lot of work to do that. And I have friends that are very good at it. But even they, it's very hard for an author to get his or her work published in a way that creates sales.
Yes, yes.
It's really hard.
You're also a faculty advisor for a
Calliope, yeah.
Calliope, a high school
Yeah, it's
magazine,
Glenbrook South's
right?
Literary and Arts magazine. It comes out twice a year.
Okay.
And we have a staff that ranges between 30 and 40 students, staff and editors. And again, it kind of mimics what we've been talking about. How do you collect works of writing and photography and visual art,
Yes, because
presented in a way that is interesting, and then publish it, and learning the skills of InDesign, for example, Adobe InDesign, which is sort of the industry standard of publishing text.
Yes.
And then getting that all together, getting it published, and then getting it distributed in a way to the student body that they will embrace it and they'll enjoy it.
yes, I noticed there are photographs taken by students and
Visual art,
artwork,
photographs, short fiction,
Poetry
essays,
and-
poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you do you work with other faculty on that, or is it
No, it's just myself and the
separately
students. Yeah.
from the Oracle and all that, right?
Yeah, although we're all sort of trying to do the same thing. Oracle is a really fine newspaper that our school produces. Yearbook is an award-winning production as well.
Yes.
And we all use InDesign to do that. So the students who are involved in all three of those publications are learning incredibly valuable skills, not only just in terms of design, but also in terms of software, you know.
Yes, organization.
Yeah.
So, about your questions, I noticed that your questions, they're not very long. Do you do you spend a lot of time editing them? Because people often don't realize how much work is in editing.
Right. Yeah, I did, once I had the questions collected, I tried to get them down to the bare essentials, and this is what all writers do.
Yes.
And it's a great exercise. It's, again, a very creative exercise, you know, making sure that, for example, putting as much in the nouns and verbs as possible,
Yeah.
not being redundant, not being clunky, not using passive voice unless it's necessary. Those are the basic things, but it matters. And again, trying to get nouns and verbs mostly that people can key into in terms of their thinking.
Yes. So, and then also you want to leave it open enough for
Absolutely.
the reader to
Yeah.
be creative.
Absolutely, yeah.
I find your book just the most interactive book I have ever come across.
Well, thank you. That's a
know?
high compliment. I appreciate
and,
that.
And that's your goal.
That's my goal, definitely.
To have a creative experience, right?
I want it to feel inviting. I want to feel like you're being invited into the question rather than
Yes.
being intimidated. I think sometimes people find questions that are deep, that are rich, intimidating, like they're being put on the spot. I want it to feel more inviting.
Maybe we should take a look at some of them.
Sure, that'd be
Okay.
great.
I just take one that
Oops. Okay.
you said that the third book has a type of narrative through the questions. Let's hear some of them, and maybe our audience can hear where this questions build up to.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll start right at the beginning with question 1.
Okay.
1, what would you like to cultivate? 2, what's on fire? 3, are you ahead of the beat or behind it? 4, what turning point would you like to create for your life? 5, what's sneaking up on you? 6, if you were a cinematographer, what would you film? 7, what would you like to pull from the wreckage? 8, what's the title of your next chapter? 9, when is exiting the wrong response? 10, what needs restarting?
I can see your questions are forward-looking and looking behind you, right?
Yeah.
There's both of this
Yeah.
perspective and turning points, like where you go. I can visualize this crossroad,
Yeah.
right? And you're at a fork, and where should you go? And
Yeah.
this is very interesting. I mean, and maybe people hadn't thought that they were at a crossroad, but these questions make you think about where do you want to go?
Yeah. And words like cultivate or exit.
Yes, it's very rod. It could be,
Yeah.
yeah, I find that very wonderful use of, I mean, it could be many layers of
Yeah.
metaphor, right?
Or the word fire. Now, fire is generally a negative word. But what if you viewed fire positively?
As a passion?
Yeah, as a passion, like what's on fire. But fire is an interesting thing in terms of creation, because creation does what fire does. It simultaneously creates and destroys, or destroys and creates. And so if you can see it both ways, then you might cultivate something. Then you might exit from something. You might start a new chapter, that sort of thing.
Those are very thought-provoking questions, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
Thank you, John, for coming on our program.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, Yvonne.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.